it seems that incentives is like one of the main issues here. Compensation has been crazy, and incentives misplaced. It's been all over the place. How do you change that, if not by better regulation? How do you change human nature, which is basically like they've been bending the rules, they've been swinging. As Roubini mentioned, he's going to be greedy in his business. I would be greedy in my business. I would do whatever it takes to maximize my profits, and that's what they've been doing. If it's not by better regulation, how do you really like, how do you change it?
Are you literally asking how do you change human nature?
No.
That seems to be,
in a way you
how
are.
do you change the incentive?
And I think maybe it's a quite relevant question.
How do you change? How do you change like how people are, the models operanti, how people are doing
put
their
together
thing?
on this one.
Alex Berenson. Aside from alcohol, I don't know. No, I think that's a really good question. As I said at the very beginning of my statement, that is not the question we're debating tonight. We're debating whether or not these firms should have behaved better under the regime that they had. That said, I think that what Neil says about increasing capital requirements is at the core. It's a very, very good idea. I can imagine, and I don't know whether this could work in reality. There'd have to be some very, very smart people to figure out if it could work. Sort of a dual system where there's one group of very, very heavily regulated, essentially postal banks that have explicit government guarantees of insurance, that offer sort of plain vanilla products, that are, you know, essentially national, quasi-national institutions. And then there's another group where anything goes. And you can make or lose whatever you want. You can pay your employees whatever you want. But if you go under, you are not getting one dime. And that is the explicit charter that you're operating under. And the difficulty is figuring out how those two systems would interface. But if you could do that, then hopefully we could avoid this problem in the future.
John Steele Gordon.
I don't know about human nature. You can't change it. I mean, that's virtually by definition. I think it was Francis Bacon who said that to rule nature, you must first obey it. And what we have to do is simply understand human nature and take it into account when we set up our rules. One thing about compensation is that it's been very fashionable in the United States for years now to have the CEO also be the chairman of the board, which makes him his own boss. And whenever you are your own boss, you are going to overpay yourself. The CEO stuffs the board with people who are dependent upon him, other high-level management. I mean, it seems to me that a corporation, unless you have enough stock to justify a seat on the board, if you work for that corporation, you shouldn't sit on the board.
There is a regulatory capture in almost every industry. The lobbyists take over the regulators and change things into their own interest. But there is only one industry, the financial industry, in which this thing leads over and over again to financial crises, banking crises, that are a disaster. They cost trillions of dollars. And ask yourself what happens and why that happens. It happens for two reasons. One, because banks have deposit insurance, the deposits are guaranteed. So you take somebody else's people money, you leverage like crazy, you do crazy things. If you gain, it's your money, otherwise it's the taxpayer. Two, we have lender of last resort support. When banks get in trouble, the Fed comes to the rescue, and it's a variant of this moral hazard of the bailout. And that's why these banking crises occur over and over and over again, and are becoming more disruptive, more expensive, and so on. That has to do key with exactly our regulatory system. That is something wrong about it. And if we don't fix it, this thing's going to happen, and the cost of it is going to become even bigger. Again, people are greedy in every industry. People in every industry try to avoid regulation, sometimes with lies, sometimes by cheating or avoiding whatever. That's human nature. Why leads to disaster in the financial industry? Because we have this system.
Sir, you have the microphone in your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. This is addressed to both groups. So it seems to me to reflect on which group deserves more blame, we have to make some assumptions, and I think the participants are making assumptions about what is behavior that's reasonable to expect from one group or another group. And then the group that departs further from those reasonable expectations gets more of the blame. But I don't think everybody agrees on what can reasonably be expected from each of the groups. So it's assumed that by some people that you can reasonably expect greedy behavior from Wall Street types. or from the people in that business, but not that it's reasonable for Congress people in the political game to try to do things to keep, this is now Minow's point, of course. So how do you decide which are the reasonable expectations from the different groups, and won't that tilt very strongly what blame you assign?
Well,
Niall Ferguson.
This isn't rocket science. One set of people under discussion owes a duty to the public interest. Those are the politicians and regulators. That is why we call them public servants. And the other group, let us take the investment bankers, because of course Wall Street is composed of many different institutions, but let's take the investment bankers. They owe a duty to their shareholders and also to bondholders. Now, it's quite interesting, though the point hasn't been made yet, that not all of these investment banks performed equally badly. The fate of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers illustrates what egregious bad management can achieve. But the performance of Goldman Sachs was really significantly different. Goldman actually didn't lose substantial amounts of money, though its shareholders have certainly taken some punishment. And the punishment has been meted out by the market to the people who invested in those banks. They will almost certainly end up with nothing. I'm fairly clear that those people who invested in financial securities will end up with very little indeed. And I think that's particularly true in the case of the big commercial banks. Can I finish? Because this is a really important point. Bank of America and of course Citigroup. But the interests of the public are to be defended by people in Washington. That is the big difference between these two groups. And that's why it's absolutely clear that we have to lay the blame on Washington. The failure of Bear Stearns was a disaster from the point of view of people who invested in it. But it became a disaster for the entire US economy, and indeed the world economy, because of failures of regulation. And those seem to me to lie very squarely in Washington, D.C.
Question from the woman in the center, please.
That not every bank failed. Not every bank behaved equally badly.
This is Alex Berenson speaking. Go ahead, Alex.
Not every bank is as responsible as every other bank for this crisis. Goldman is going to get by along, Goldman's going to get along fine. There are going to be commercial banks that get along fine.
It helps that AIG has been bailed out, of course. Let's not lose sight of that twist in the tail.
But wouldn't you agree that that shows that there were distinctions made on the street?
Ma'am, I encourage you to break into this exchange with your question.
I know that given all the discussion about greed at financial institutions, many of us would assume that there were many good people at these companies who were simply afraid to say something about what they saw. And my question is for anyone on the panel, can you envision a way to effectively institutionalize financial company employees' ability to report irregularities or essentially poor practices in ways that couldn't be, that you can't simply
I'm not really sure
avoid.
I agree with that. I mean, there were not whistleblowers jumping up and calling the New York Times to tell us about things. And even Enron, and Jim knows, Jim certainly knows more about Enron than anybody. The whistleblowers really were, very, very late in the game.
Gives huge protections to whistleblowers and incentives to whistleblowers. So I really don't think that's the problem.